So we got chapter 10 here, the working day. Um, so this is going to be Marx laying out a lot of evidence and historical progression and development about the struggle of the length of the working day. So this is basically the how long you're working during a day if you're a worker. And he starts out by saying, okay, so like a given portion of the day is always going to be reserved for your necessary labor time. For now, we're not even going to really do that much math in this discussion. It's too much, but yeah, he's saying, well, imagine you have to work a minimum of 6 hours. Any hour after that is surplus labor. That is basically going straight to surplus value. In other words, it's unpaid labor, and that's where profit comes from. So he does mention here that it is not a constant, it's a variable. And obviously we know that's true because when we read this text, Marx is mostly talking about a 12-hour workday, but we don't see that as often nowadays. It's usually 8 is sort of the typical, typically what people mean by a full working day. And while it is a variable, it only fluctuates within certain limits, which is sort of obvious because we know a day is 24 hours long. And within 24 hours, you can't be working all 24. I mean, if you do that, then probably won't do anything the next 24 hours. But we know that capital needs to keep exploiting labor consistently. So we're going to basically say that's the maximum, which is basically a combination of just the physical limits of human beings, how much they're able to work within a day, and obviously the day itself. And then the minimum is, I kind of went backwards, but whatever. The minimum here is the necessary labor. It's basically it's how much you're working to just pay for your own wage, right? So if I got paid $10, I don't know, to work that day, I have to work a certain number of hours that equals $10. However many hours that ends up being is obviously depends on just the material conditions around you, what's the historical context, etc. And then any time I work beyond that is surplus. And clearly, the capitalist wants to make that surplus as long as possible, and the workers want it to be as short as possible. And that's going to be kind of the basis of class struggle. But before we go any further, let's stop at one of the all-time great passages in Capital, which is on page 342 here. So I'll start here. He says, at all events, it, meaning the working day, is less than a natural day. How much less? Well, the capitalist has his own views of this point of no return, the necessary limit of the working day. And as a capitalist, he is only capital personified. His soul is the soul of capital, but capital has one sole driving force: the drive to valorize itself, to create surplus value, to make its constant part, the means of production, absorb the greatest possible amount of surplus labor. Capital is dead labor, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. The time during which the worker works is the time during which the capitalist consumes the labor power.
Well, god damn it. Okay, sorry.
That is the quote. Yep. If the worker consumes his disposable time for himself, he robs the capitalist, which would be based. And I'm no professional.
Earlier discussion.
I'm not a professional career advice person, but working as little as possible and taking that time on the clock to yourself is based. Just that's basically what it means.
Always poop at work.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And if you can, without getting caught, clock in before you start commuting. That's something else I tried to do. I eventually got told off for it. But because they'd be like, I realize you arrive really consistently at like 9:05 every morning. You clock in at like 8:45. I'm like, man, that's weird. I don't know what that is. Strange. Couldn't possibly be the 20-minute commute where I'm paying for my own gas and not getting paid for it. Weird. Anyways, yeah, so now he's sort of laid out at least one dimension of class struggle. We know there's many, many dimensions to it. But along this dimension, labor and capital are basically struggling over how long the working day is. Capital wanting it to be as long as possible, and labor wanting it to be as short as possible.
Hey, look, it's dialectics.
Yeah, that is what it means. So, to get to the wrap up of section 1 here, he says, we see then that, leaving aside certain extremely elastic restrictions, the nature of commodity exchange itself imposes no limit to the working day and no limit to surplus labor. The capitalist maintains his rights as a purchaser when he tries to make the working day as long as possible, and where possible, make 2 working days out of 1. On the other hand, the peculiar nature of the commodity sold implies a limit to its consumption by the purchaser, and the worker maintains his right as a seller when he wishes to reduce the working day to a particular normal length. There is here, therefore, an antinomy of right against right, both equally bearing the seal of the law of exchange. Between equal forces, before equal rights, force decides. Hence, in the history of capitalist production, the establishment of a norm for the working day presents itself as a struggle over the limits of that day. Struggle between collective capital, i.e. the class of capitalists, and collective labor, i.e. the working class. There we go. He has laid out the contradiction that we're going to be looking at for the rest of the chapter. And I know David Hardy mentioned this, but it's a really good point, is that, he's in this little exchange, he's referencing right against right, which of course we're very familiar with liberals foaming at the mouth over rights all the time. And yeah, sure, legally, this is all perfectly legal, and capitalists have a right to do this, and workers have a right to struggle against capital. But if you're legally equal, in other words, like the state is not intervening, then the one who's going to win the struggle has more force. Like, basically, who has the numbers, who has the political power or social power in terms of like just money, the ability to procure resources. And typically, well, at least when Marx is writing, it seems like typically capital would be in the more powerful position. And that it takes a pretty significant amount of working class solidarity and organizing to, combat that sort of overwhelming force that capitalists are able to wield, how much capital they actually command. And so basically, it's Marx's way of saying, this isn't a political battle over rights necessarily. It is a class struggle. That's what he's trying to get us to look at. So try and use that reframing, I think, when you do encounter the annoying liberal who's like, well, we should just vote harder, basically. It's like, well, no, we technically already have the right to struggle over the working day. And capital has the right to exploit the shit out of us. So it's almost like the laws in the political arena is almost a side effect of the class struggle. The class struggle is the primary contradiction here. I think that's another way of putting it. Okay. Now we got section 2, the voracious appetite for surplus labor, manufacturer and boyar. So this is the first section where I'll go into a lot of historical evidence and development and stuff like that. So I won't go crazy into that. Obviously, this is a very good chapter, I will say. I mostly listened to the audiobook version just because I was a little busy this week. And the narrator on the YouTube audiobook did a pretty solid job of like getting really into it, especially when you can tell like Marx is writing angry, and he was pretty pissed at all the working conditions and child labor going. But yeah. So he starts out here just reiterating that capital did not invent surplus labor, and that wherever a part of society possesses the monopoly on the means of production, which we can just interpret as like a ruling class, the worker, free or unfree, must add to the labor time necessary for his own maintenance an extra quantity of labor time in order to produce the means of subsistence for the owner of the means of production. Whoever's owning the monopoly on the means of production is assumed not to be working, and therefore whoever is working, the worker in some given time period, that could be slaves, artisans, serfs, peasants, factory workers, blah blah blah. Because there are members of the population that are not working, they need to produce an excess in labor in order to pay for their existence, if you will. So, yeah, and he gives some examples here of, previous ruling classes, basically. So, like some Athenian, is this the translation? Handsome and good, yeah. Some aristocrat, theocrats, barons, American slave owners, Wallachian boyar, whatever that is, or the modern landlord or capitalists. Always love to see Marx, shooting some strays at the landlords, because, yeah.
I mean, they do paint a really big target on themselves for gravitational checking facilities.
Yeah. And they are like the explicit definition of a ruling class that simply owns stuff and does absolutely no work.
Full on parasites.
Exactly. So yeah, they fall under the same umbrella, even if they're not like expressly capitalists. At least not by Marx's definition. It's slightly different, right? I don't even know if Volume 1 will actually get into the difference between like rent seeking versus like surplus value production in terms of like commodity production. Might be Volume 3. Remember, something like that. All right, so yeah, so he lays that out, right? That surplus, like the expropriation of surplus labor, is not new. It's not new to capitalism. But he does say somewhere in here. So yeah, one of the differences for capitalism is that surplus labor and necessary labor are mingled together. And he says, I can therefore express the same relation by saying, for instance, that in every minute, the worker worked 30 seconds for himself and 30 seconds for the capitalist. and he's comparing that to the corvée, contrasting that. But again, this kind of theme of capitalism being very mysterious and mystifying, basically there's a lot of fetishizing going on, so it obscures where exactly the surplus labor is being extracted. Because yes, you could, if you had enough data, you might be able to derive like, okay, yeah, your first 6 hours is working for yourself and the second 6 hours is working for the capitalist. But in reality, the line between the two is very fuzzy, very difficult to measure for the worker, so it's not immediately obvious. And in fact, most people, not only is it not obvious, but most people have just, swallowed the propaganda whole and are like, no, I don't, when I go to work, I'm not getting exploited, I'm getting paid. It's like,
voluntary
you fool.
participation.
Yeah.
Yuck.
Yeah, exactly. It's surprisingly easy to deceive people that, because you're getting paid for some of your labor, they just assume they're getting paid for all of it.
If you go to work and you get paid to, I don't know, make screws, and you get $5 an hour to make $10 an hour worth of screws, you are not getting paid. You are paying the owner of the screw manufacturing plant.
Yeah, pretty much.
Was your choice of screws there intentional?
No, actually, it wasn't.
It's an excellent pun, nonetheless.
My brain just automatically creates puns because I am an old man with a very dry, stupid sense of humor.
Funny enough, I think later on in the chapter there's a brief section on like a nail factory. So surprisingly close to what Marx actually does talk about. I don't know if screws had been invented at this time. It's a good question, actually. But nails definitely were. Okay, so I'm skipping ahead some more here. This is 348. So he's talking about some of the English factory laws going on. So he says that these laws curb capital's drive towards a limitless draining away of labor power by forcibly limiting the working day on the authority of the state ruled by capitalists and landlord. Apart from the daily more threatening advance of the working class movement, the limiting of the factory labor was dictated by the same necessity as forced the manuring of English fields with guano. The same blind desire for profit that in the one case exhausted the soil had in the other case seized hold of the vital force of the nation at its roots. Periodic epidemics speak as clearly on this point as the diminishing military standard of height in France and Germany. So this is a reference, I think, to chapter 1, I want to say, where Marx lays out that the two sources of value are basically the natural world, natural resources, pretty much, nature with capital N, and labor, which technically he said falls under the umbrella of a force of nature, because humans are, of course, part of the natural world and all that. And so he's saying that, the same necessity that forced the manuring of English fields with guano. I think did we talk about this last time, I think, the whole guano situation?
Yes, we did, with the mining out of entire islands and a
Correct.
little bit of discussion upon possible disease variables.
Exactly. And part of the big reason they even shipped guano from all over the damn place into Europe is to replenish the fields of basically essential nutrients like nitrogen stuff.
Nitrogen.
And so that is basically Marx's way of saying, if capitalism is left unchecked to just do its thing, it will ravage its only source of value that it needs to survive, which is the natural environment and labor. So he says, like the ravaging of the natural environment, where we needed to come up with some way of mitigating that with guano. Similarly, these laws, like the English Factory Acts and all that, actually, in a similar way, are like a adaptation in order to prevent capital from running amok and self-destructing. So, yeah, if you're basically overproducing in your fields, and producing just a shit ton of crops, you're not doing enough rotations, blah blah blah. There's a lot, if you're basically doing shitty agriculture, you're gonna ruin your fields and cause famines and stuff. And this, by the way, was pretty common throughout history, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, isn't that part of why the Dust Bowl happened?
100%.
It definitely is. Even though the techniques they existed, the techniques to do it sustainably existed. They were of no interest to capitalist agriculture, because we
Can't
got
extract it fast enough.
yeah. So
Line no go up fast, therefore no do.
Mm-hmm.
this is an interesting point, though. I think, in that these sort of legal limits on the working day that he says are imposed by the authority of the state and so forth are actually good for capital in the long run. Because remember that capital, and by extension capitalists, are constantly obsessed with making very, very short-term decisions, short-term considerations, because they need to increase their margins rapidly today. Whereas in the long run, that behavior is ultimately self-destructive. But when you have the state step in and throw in some nice limitations, like, hey, maybe don't just kill off your entire workforce by overworking them, because that would also make capital impossible, because if you have no one left to exploit, you're kind of fucked. That these legal limits are actually, in a roundabout way, they seem like they're bad for capital, because he already laid out the problem, right? That capital wants the working day to be long. But if you take that slider and slide it all the way to its maximum, it's going to burn out very quickly and just cause a serious crisis. And if you kind of slide it the other way and absolutely minimize the working day, then you can't make profit at all. And from capital's perspective, that's also no bueno. So really, for capital's sake, the sweet spot of the working day, well, it is a sweet spot. It's somewhere between those two extremes, where you want to be pushing your workers as much as possible without permanently exhausting them. In other words, like crippling their ability to work. And the state ultimately had to interfere and, intervene in order for the capitalist system not to self-destruct. So this is kind of another interesting example, really important example actually, of the state being pretty necessary for capitalist development. Not only can the state act as the basically the fist of capital, so to speak, to squash workers' movements, basically be wielded like a weapon in the class struggle. It can also be used as brakes and sort of safety valves to prevent capital from self-destructing.
It does also kind of, and I don't know if you were about to get to this, but he then kind of goes on to mention sort of offhand and then elaborate in a footnote to the point that the state has its own self-interest in making these regulations, because you essentially, if your capitalists take your working class and work them to death and make them sickly and poor, and ultimately, I guess here very specifically short.
Yeah.
They don't have enough able-bodied people to go to war if they need to.
Right.
Um,
Like this is wild, right? Where they say back in 1780, Saxony is England. Is Saxony in England or is that France? I don't
France. It's sort of like it's like right there on the edge of the channel, and it's culturally weird.
know. Okay, that's what I
Um,
figured.
yeah.
But yeah, basically he says like, oh yeah, their standard height was like 178 centimeters, almost 6 feet tall, I think. But then now, meaning whenever Marx wrote this, probably somewhere in the 1860s, it dropped like over 20 centimeters, probably due to just severe malnutrition. Yeah, there are other dimensions
155,
to.
157. I mean, that's my height, and I am a very small woman.
Yeah, yeah. So you're right. There are more ramifications than simply. Obviously, the state doesn't want their own economy to crash. And that should be a given. But there are even other considerations beyond that of like this, for example, like a super malnourished army is going to be a pretty shit army. For example,
And to a degree, we're even starting to see problems with that in the United States, with with the working class and the working poor being at such a point where they make so little, and the only food they can afford is generally pretty crap. That
Yeah, malnutrition with high calorie food.
right, so you're ending up with these often overweight yet malnourished young adults who normally would be the folks that the military would want to try to recruit, except for they don't meet the medical or physical standards, and they've had to lower them multiple times within the last decade. And there's always much hand wringing and etc. about that, and it's always turned into more of a generational blame sort of thing rather than anybody bothering to take a look at, oh well, maybe there's another reason for this. But hey, if I guess the one upside to that is we have less meat to put into the imperialist grinder.
Something system eating itself from the inside out.
Yeah.
This sounds like a standard business model, doesn't it?
Anyway.
it does. Yeah, no, that's actually a really interesting parallel, though. I didn't think about that when I was reading it, but it makes a lot of sense that we're kind of seeing the same thing, just in a very different way.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost rewrite the entirety of this chapter with modern day parallels that are so spookily the same thing.
Another dimension that isn't related to physical well-being, though, mental well-being.
Oh,
that
absolutely.
is becoming much more. Yeah, that's becoming much more like normally recognized. Even though I think in most mainstream outlets they're not going to directly connect it back to capitalism's issue, but when you have a economic
there's a financial incentive not to.
Well, yeah, exactly. They're not gonna consciously do that. Even subconsciously, they'll look for any other thing to blame. Right? They'll blame
anything but the blinking neon sign in front of their faces.
Right, yeah.
I think
they'll blame, like you said, they'll blame like the generation. Just the youngins they're born with anxiety. They're born depressed. It's like
the latest thing that I saw, and I shit you not, I saw this like 2 days ago. Is now they're blaming the military being too woke,
which is hilarious.
Which I'm like, oh, what? How? What? Words have no meaning anymore.
Right.
We are in a
post-satire world.
Yeah. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. Though, is like in the theme of capital constantly undermining its own source of valorization, like basically mentally scarring all of your workers into being very troubled people is like not good for productivity. Yeah,
Like
just constantly
it's like
undermining.
I need more than one hand to count the number of people I know who've been diagnosed with CPTSD due to workplace trauma.
Yeah,
Working retail, the best way to traumatize yourself.
and then shit. I mean, Marx doesn't get into it that much. It's a lot of it's implied, but man, if mental health had been a thing back when he was writing, oh my god, the amount of PTSD and trauma these poor people went through is pretty unimaginable.
Oh, creating fully broken generations. It's a long-standing tradition of see that whole comment I made at the start of this of, well, let's see how many times we can reinvent slave labor.
Like, yeah, that interview, I think from one of the factory inspectors where he interviews like a 7-year-old in this,
Oh yeah.
or no, it's like a 10-year-old who's been working since he was 7 or something like that.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, I've worked like 12-hour days since I was 7 years old, every goddamn day, maybe Sundays off. I was like, oh, that is so fucked. That is so fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's see, 352 here. Again, I think this is in the. I want to say this is in the factory inspector's report stuff he's going through. So they're talking about the profit to be gained by it being the overworking in violation of the act, appears to be to many a greater temptation than they can resist. They calculate upon the chance of not being found out, and when they see the small amount of penalties and costs which those have been convicted have had to pay, they find that if they should be detected, there will be a considerable balance of gain. Again, sound familiar? Right? When you have fines and like penalties, those are just a cost of doing business, right?
If the
but it's
fine
totally
isn't
fine,
more
'cause-
than you earn, then it's a cost of business.
but it's totally fine. Norfolk Southern is giving $5 million to everyone in the fucking town.
Didn't that come out to like $5 a person?
Something
Or
like,
something super insulting?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, we blew up a train in your town. Buy yourself some McDonald's, I guess, you poors.
It absolutely kills me though that people look at like, oh well, they're paying the restitution and they're paying for the cleanup and whatever, and it's like, okay, even if it's like a decent amount of money, that is absolutely factored into their cost of doing business because it is cheaper to pay restitution and cleanup for the occasional
Disaster.
than it is to actually create systemic improvements.
All of that is not wrong.
Here's this
But I
classic
have to,
diagram.
hang on. I really have to interject here for a minute because they are paying for restitution and cleanup of a single instance. When we
They
have
had multiple crashes this year.
Yeah, no, one every 2 days.
Yeah, I believe it was 1,000. God, how many? I need to take a look because the actual statistic for train derailment in the U.S. is insane.
Anyway,
I mean, I was looking at your graphic that you put up there, Grade A. I actually had written like in very large letters in the corner of page 350, wage theft.
Anyway, there's the other aspect of this, which is that you can't clean this shit up. This is forever. You can move it around, but these are the forever chemicals that you hear about. You don't clean shit up. This is there is no they could pay infinite amounts of money and still not solve this problem. they have introduced a permanent change to the ecology through negligence.
Because they don't carbon bind at all.
Mm-hmm.
Also, super
And
looking forward to JT's upcoming video on this.
oh yeah, that'll be interesting.
Oh, did he say he's working on wage theft? Or
Yeah,
something?
I think he
Mhm.
says it's coming out the first.
Wait, is it
I think
wage
he
theft
said.
or the train situation?
The train thing? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay,
We're
okay.
like kind of in. We're kind of like having two parallel conversations. I'm
True.
sorry.
It's fine. Because I mean, they're parallel, but they're all ultimately the same origin, which is
Yes.
regulations
Right.
are a mere inconvenience and slight cost of business, basically.
Right.
Because yeah, I mean, ultimately, Nikolai's on target here. That like, you have major oil spills or just any chemical spill, for example. Yeah, you're gonna get hit with a fine, and maybe like face litigation from the government that might force you to clean it up. Like I know BP, the BP settlement after the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon.
Deepwater
I
Horizon.
believe that was the largest settlement in U.S. history.
Yeah,
something like
4
this.
billion, I believe.
$4 billion, but I think the cost of cleanup ended up being another like 20 billion or something insane. But compare that to the actual profits of the oil and gas industry, of which BP is a part of. It's still kind of a drop in the bucket. Because yeah, oil and gas companies have like just stupid amounts of capital. So yeah, even for them, like a $20 billion hit
Is nothing.
over the course of however long they've been in operation is really not that much. I'm sure it sucked for 1 year, a couple of years, but they're like, whatever, we'll make it back lickety split.
I feel like this goes back to something we were saying maybe last week or a couple of weeks ago, that in the event that a company has what's determined to be essentially a preventable negligent disaster, that the punishment should automatically just nationalize the company. Just everybody
That was
out.
last week.
Was that last week? Time has
That
no
was
meaning
last
to me.
week. Yeah.
Yep, we can wish.
I'd love if it was last week or 2 weeks ago, but yeah.
But yeah, I think it's obviously because of the recency of all that shit. We can point to it, but I think Marx is referring more to these, for example, wage theft situations where, as he quotes these people, these small thefts of capital from the workers' meal times and recreation times are also described by the factory inspectors as petty pilferings of minutes. And then he says, it is evident that in this atmosphere of the formation of surplus value by surplus labor is no secret. If you allow me to work only 10 minutes in the day overtime, you put 1,000 a year in my pocket. Summarizes it by saying that moments are the element of profit. So yeah, interesting enough, right? Meal times, recreation times, these breaks. I mean, there's research that has dollar amounts on that, and it's in the billions. Because yeah, you might be stealing a few minutes here and there, but minutes add up to hours, and hours add up to days, especially over the course of a whole working year. That ends up being a shit ton of unpaid labor, and that's sort of on top of the surplus value that you're contracted for, right? Because when you sign your work contract, again, you don't really know exactly how much of your time is necessary and how much is surplus. But they're going to try and eat up every minute they can to make sure that surplus is just a little bit bigger.
That phrase, the moments are the elements of profit. I feel like if taken from the side of the worker, obviously you can kind of see that as, you know, every moment that you're not spending working is a moment that you're essentially stealing money from your employer, which based.
Bunch of horse shit.
But I made a note here that if you look at that from the side of capital, or even from the side of, you know, I'm going to say the capital sympathizers, the petite bourgeoisie, whatever, um, that this is how you essentially get like internalized capitalism and like hustle mindset and all of that garbage, where even if you don't necessarily want to think that way, you're thinking like every moment that you're spending just kind of like chilling in the evening watching TV or doing something for yourself is like a moment that you're not making money.
Oh, and it leads to a violently transactional interaction with everyone around you, and it is super not healthy.
No,
Having some
absolutely not.
fun going over that thought process and basically personal application of it to family members growing up. It's like, wow, that was super internalized in a not useful fashion.
I mean, uh, I saw a story earlier about the Twitter employee who kind of like got some notoriety for like sleeping on the floor after Elon Musk took over. Apparently, just got laid off,
Rip
and I'm
Bozo.
just like, and I'm like, and I shared and I shared it with somebody. And I'm like, your job will never love you back. That's really just all you need to know.
We're a family here. We just happen to be a family of people who will harvest your organs the second you fall asleep.
But yeah, like for such a short little statement here, I mean, like there is so much you can unpack out of that.
Hmm.
Yeah, it really lays like a lot of the foundation for neoliberalism, the whole like personal responsibility for every second of your life, which is so insidious because I know from, again, kind of to take another step back to like the mental health ramifications of this. You know, we're raised as children where we have very minimal responsibilities across the board, right? And then like right around sometime in high school, usually we all just get collectively gaslit into being like, why aren't you a productive member of society, even though you're still developing child,
They
basically.
asked it about like time management and why
Yeah.
can't you do these 6 hours of homework and like the 4 hours that you're awake after you get home, you know? I
Right.
mean,
It's like at some point, you know, a lot of parents seem to also have internalized this, and at some point they just, it's like a flip switch, or switch flips, and they are like, well, all of a sudden you're no longer, you know, a child I'm taking care of. You are a person in my house who's not paying rent. That kind of mentality that's just so fucking toxic. And I would not be surprised if there were actual research done on this, that I'm sure that traumatizes basically everybody.
Yep, I dealt with exactly that phenomena.
see
I mean,
that.
it's one of the most normal things, regardless of like income bracket. Seriously, like, you know, when you hit like 16, it's suddenly like you need to get a job to do all this shit and go get raked over the coals by someone who's going to pay you like maybe $10 an hour. And yeah, you just, that total shift from being a child to being a basically child worker, or at least being expected to be, you know, go to college, get an education, if that's even like an option, um, in order to become a worker that can make like a slightly more reasonable salary or something like that. You know,
Or
that whole
in my-
total shift
in-
in perspective, I think, is very alarming for most young people. And that's why like high school can be insane, and early college and all that. Like basically your late teens, early 20s can be like an insanely stressful period.
In my case, it was being kicked out of my house, having to work a full-time job, and also trying to do what was, socially expected of me, which was to also go to college full-time. So full-time college, full-time job.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
I mean,
means
I guess I said it is more. It's like normalized across income brackets. That may not totally be true. I guess I can imagine. I've definitely met people who had like super rich parents and they didn't need to work, even if they ended up working just for like the hell of it.
even
So I
those
dig.
people
Yeah.
though have even those people though have familial connections in which they get, uh, a leg up into like nepotistic job placement.
Oh yeah.
I was fortunate, put that in air quotes, in the sense that my dad grew up in a family that was very transactional like that, and it pissed him off so bad that he swore that he'd never do that to his own children. So I escaped that literally because my dad was actively trying to break that cycle of abuse.
That's good.
Yeah.
Your dad sounds pretty cool.
I mean, like, he has his moments, but he frustrates the hell out of me nonetheless.
Okay, so I am zipping pretty much straight past section 3. Not because it is bad, it is quite good. But it is
Section 3
just
is where
pretty
I
much
employ.
completely empirical stuff.
Yeah. I employed the audiobook for a lot of the sort of
Hmm.
stuff that felt really kind of ethnographic.
It's a bunch of fucking math.
Not this
Nobody.
stuff. I don't.
No, no,
This
not
is
that.
not as much math. This is like Marx. It's a lot of historical evidence. It's basically this is like where Marx was in the library in London or whatever, looking at all these old fucking factory inspection reports and just spilling the tea and being very angry about it. So it's pretty cool. Like honestly, yes, definitely I recommend that audio book that I linked in the chat. The guy that narrates it did a really good job on these sections. So like there it's definitely, I mean, prepare to get a little tilted listening to it because you're just like, what the actual fuck? Like, I mean, I know things are rough now, but they used to be so much worse.
Do not listen to this if you happen to be, for example, doing the dishes, lest you be inclined to start throwing breakable items.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a lot of this chapter, and it is really good. It's actually a very different style than some of the other, like, the more mathematic, the more technical side. That's like chapter 11. It kind of switches gears back to that stuff for a little bit.
Actually, what a lot of this reminded me of, and I really should go the other way because of time, but a lot of Barbara Ehrenreich's ethnographies,
Yeah.
where where she talked to a lot of working people about, or even herself kind of place herself within the working, within the working groups of people, and kind of really spilling the tea about like kind of the internal messed upness. But yeah, the styles to me are very similar. I mean, and I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that Barbara Ehrenreich has read Marx.
Yeah, I will here. I'll at least go over the end of this section because it's a pretty good summary of it. Let's see, about here roughly. I think this is a quote from this guy, Dr. Richardson. So it says, the occupation, instinctive almost as a portion of human art, unobjectionable as a branch of human industry, is made by mere excess of work, the destroyer of the man. He can strike so many blows per day, walk so many steps, breathe so many breaths, produce so much work, and live an average of, say, 50 years. He is made to strike so many more blows, to walk so many more steps, to breathe so many more breaths per day, and to increase altogether a fourth of his life. He meets the effort, and the result is that producing for a limited time a fourth more work, he dies at 37 for 50. So this doctor, basically, that Marx is citing here, essentially was estimating that this crisis of, capitalist overworking was literally killing people, like, earlier. And his estimation was someone who would normally live about 50 years might be living 37 years tops. And a lot of that, they go into more detail in the chapter, but it's stuff like inhaling toxic ceramic dust, or, fucking all the horrendous vapors and gases in, like,
mercury
iron
vapor
forges
from glaziers and freaking silver workers.
Yeah, I mean, there's so little safety regulation, pretty much none, actually, way back in the day. So yeah, people basically were just getting poisoned on the daily, and then you add on top of that the malnutrition, the just permanent fatigue, and probably lack of sleep, and all, who knows how many health complications. Yeah, people just straight up were dying, like, way earlier than they should have. And I mean, part of that's also the no modern medicine, but realistically, like, that's what this doctor guy's saying, is that even without modern medicine, which they did not have, right? Maybe basic medicine, a person who's expected to live to 50 would not even close to that. They'd die significantly earlier. And they also get into, I think, some of the children also die, like, as children. They literally don't make it to, like, adolescence, because they just fucking die in the factories, and they're like, well, who cares? Like, just get another one. Slot them in there.
See the Dinosaurs movie quote, not Dinosaurs, the show. We're gonna need another Timmy.
Yeah.
From the old sitcom.
Yeah. The other, I think Harvey brought this up, and I think they also mentioned it in the Marx Madness podcast, about how some other countries, Japan in particular, literally has, like, a thing that they can write on a death certificate as a cause of death as being, like, death from overwork.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
And and that it's kind of somewhat shocking that, one, they have a word for it, but also, two, that we don't.
Yeah, I guess that's interesting. Part of me wonders if they're just more specific in the West, like, oh, it's like, I don't know, heart failure or something. And it's like, well,
A lot of times they'll do things like heart failure due to COPD or something like that, So it'll be like a specific, like, acute cause, and then usually, if possible, related to a chronic cause.
Exactly. That's what I was just about to say. Yeah, it's like they might be really specific in one sense of, like, oh, like, his heart stopped working. Duh, and then they die. It's like, yeah, but how does someone's heart go from being being fine, perfectly functional, to not working at all and they die? Like, there's a lot of intermediate steps that we're skipping over to get to, oh, their heart stopped, or, like, they had a stroke, or they had one of 1 million different types of cancer that they probably got working with, like, deadly chemicals.
At the age of 37, too.
Right. So if in Japan, I don't specifically know how they do that, but that they do have a specific category for the keeping of statistics of death by overwork. And whether or not they say, this person had a heart attack and it's attributed to overwork, or they had a stroke attributed to overwork, or whatever, or if it just they're just kind of like whatever physiological cause, but
Right.
overwork was definitely the reason. I guess it's interesting that they have that in both a kind of bad way that they have that, but also a good way that they track it.
Yeah, I would be curious how the doctors reach that conclusion.
Right.
But yeah.
I mean, I guess you'd have to have a little bit of background on the person's life, I suppose, but
Yeah, that's definitely pretty interesting.
just seems like an interesting statistic to track and possibly a useful one.
Yeah, I agree. I know there definitely smells like there's some ideology in there, especially in the
Oh yeah,
Western
almost
side of
certainly.
things. Okay, so let's see, section 4 here. Day work and night work, the shift system. Again, this is largely empirical. So he's just going to go through a lot of evidence, but at least to get into his introduction into the topic, we'll go over that real quick. So he says constant capital, aka the means of production, only exists considered from the standpoint of the process of valorization in order to absorb labor, and with every drop of labor, a proportional quantity of surplus labor. Insofar as the means of production fail to do this, their mere existence forms a loss for the capitalist, in a negative sense, for while they lie fallow, they represent a useless advance of capital. This loss becomes a positive one as soon as the interruption of employment necessitates an additional outlay when the work begins again. The prolongation of the working day beyond the limits of the natural day into the night only acts as a I don't know why I can't say the word. Palliative? Nope. That's not right. Palliative? No.
Palliative. Yeah.
Okay.
There we go. Right word.
Let's see. It only slightly quenches the vampire thirst for the living blood of labor. Capitalist production therefore drives, by its inherent nature, towards the appropriation of labor throughout the whole of the 24 hours of the day. But since it is physically impossible to exploit the same individual labor power constantly during the night as well as the day, capital has to overcome this physical obstacle. An alteration becomes necessary between the labor powers used up by day and those used up by night. This can be accomplished in various ways. For instance, it may be arranged that part of the working personnel is employed for 1 week on a day work and for the next on night work. It is well known that this shift system, this alternation of two sets of workers, predominated in the full-blooded springtime of the English cotton industry, and at the present time it still flourishes, among other places, in the cotton spinning factories of the Moscow gubernia. So, yeah, Marx also kind of tries to explain the origin of the shift cycle, which some of us are probably familiar with. So there's obviously the day shift, the night shift. Even those can be broken up into smaller segments, right?
First, second, third, fourth shift, etc.
Yeah, I was going to say 4 shifts is probably the most common one I've heard of. Where you've got basically, well, it's either 3 8-hour shifts or like 4 6-hour shifts. I think it's one of those two, probably, is what you'll see. Maybe in Marx's time, he's probably referring to 2 different 12-hour shifts. Is probably what he's referring to. I'm almost positive that's what he's referring to.
I guess on 368 he says 12 hours by night or day for all workers.
Yeah, they probably had not achieved a 3-shift cycle of 3 8-hour shifts or 4 6-hour shifts.
Yeah,
So
he does later on get to a point where after numbers of reforms with the shift work for kids in particular, that they start working shorter shifts or at least some of them do, so that they can kind of play math games and make them work longer shifts later into the night. But spoiler alert. But the thing here about shift work that he brings up and kind of goes into some depth in footnote 62, but on 368 he says, leaving aside the generally harmful effects of night labor, and then kind of goes into more detail in the footnote. You see articles now, and I'm going to say within maybe like the last 10 years, where they're like, oh, working nights, has been shown to like shorten lifespan and have all of these adverse health effects, et cetera, et cetera. And then you read down in this footnote, and I'm like, this is not new. This is
super not new.
We've known this.
Yeah, humans are not nocturnal. Also,
Some of us are,
vitamin D.
but-
Vitamin D is good for you.
Mm-hmm.
Strongly recommend anyone who lives in the north, where the sun don't shine, get yourself some vitamin D pills. Or
Fun
gummies
with
or
Discord.
something. But yeah, it's true. If you're in a factory all night and sleeping in your house all day, not getting enough sunlight, that can definitely fuck with you. I'm sure there's other. I mean, I'm guessing
There are a
skimming
whole
through the
lot of
footnote.
other issues.
Yeah, I'm skimming through the footnote. Obviously, I don't think there's any mention of vitamin D, so they may not have
No,
known
I
about
don't
that at
think
the
they do.
time. But
But
yeah,
they do talk about, like, light also acts upon the tissues, the body, directly in hardening them and supporting their elasticity, which is what vitamin D does.
right. Okay, so they
Collagen.
they had an idea.
They knew, but they didn't know yet. But like he also mentions that like a lot of, especially like the younger boys who would work at night, they wouldn't necessarily go home and sleep. They'd want to be awake and do,
Hey, kids.
little boy stuff. And so they just weren't sleeping.
Yeah, you can only do that for so long.
Yeah. It's like after a certain point, you start hallucinating ants.
Oh, come on. The shadow people are your friends.
Oh, no. I owe the Hat Man money.
Hmm.
Except nowadays the kids don't want to sleep to do those. Isn't it like the Mr. Beast challenge of gotta keep your hand on like a car or something for a really long time, and if you take your hand off, or the last one to take their hand off gets to keep it or something. It's like
I don't know
another.
if Mr. Beast did
I don't know
that,
if kids. I don't think it's for kids, but
I
This
saw
is-
something like that I saw something like that like on like a fictional TV show. I don't know if that was based on something that happened in real
I'm
life.
almost positive Mr. Beast has done that. Guy is definitely a fuckhead. But yeah, it's just like, man, it's fucked up. It's fucked up to make people not sleep.
Oh, yeah. There have also
Yes.
been other dumb
So that's
24-hour challenges
So
Yeah.
in the same
24
vein.
hours is not too bad if you do it like only once in a while, but
the hallucinations usually start about 60
3.
hours in.
About 3 days in, yeah.
Yeah.
That's when the shadow people come out.
Yeah.
all right. So again, we'll fast forward through section 4. Yeah, basically talking about the night shifts in general, which again, just the takeaway for that is, Capital's trying to use every minute available to it in the day to extract capital or surplus value from its workers. So obviously one way it gets around that is to exploit lots of different workers at different times of the day, so that there's no downtime, because that is the modern day technical jargon I'm familiar with, because I've heard it a lot. Downtime may as well be the great evil to capitalists.
You're stealing from the company by creating excess downtime.
I mean, even if you're not, yeah, it's even if it's not the workers stealing hours, it's like if they have to, for example, in I know that in like the dairy industry, for example, they have to shut down the plant where they do all like the pasteurization and things like that. They've got to shut everything down every other day or something like that to
They need to be sterilized.
yeah, they need to
frequently.
clean everything because they need to prevent the bacteria. I don't remember the name of it.
I believe it's a iteration of Streptococcus. Because
That's one
there are
of them.
quite a
Yeah.
few, and E. coli is another one, and Salmonella, I think, is the other.
Yeah.
Those are the three big ones.
Yeah, there's one more I'm trying to think of. But
Oh, Listeria.
yes, Listeria.
Yeah, Listeria is the other big one.
That's the one. Yeah, I actually talked to like a professor who does like dairy industry stuff. I think they said Listeria is one of the nasty
Oh,
ones
yeah.
too. I mean, E. coli and all those other ones are like pretty basic. Very well.
Yeah.
They're in every food industry, but Listeria is especially bad in dairy.
Right, especially cheese.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so, like in Listeria, if you're healthy, it sucks, but it's not like too bad. But if you're like immune compromised or pregnant, like, oh my god.
Yeah. This is why I haven't drank milk since I was a child, because once I learned how it gets made, it's like, oh god, it's not pretty. But anyways, yeah. For example, right? This professor is basically letting us know that in the industry, they've got to shut down production very consistently, approximately every 48 hours, to do like a full blown clean of the entire production floor, basically, to make sure that there's no contamination from listeria. Any sort of bacteria was no good, obviously. And for dairy's already has like insanely
Not really bad
thin
for anyone else, or
margins.
just me.
Me too.
Yeah, he was cutting out a little.
It was
Am I
doing it
cutting out?
earlier too.
Yeah.
No, the stream.
The stream?
Oh, the stream is? It's not really moving, right?
Yeah, it did a little bit earlier too.
Audio
I
should
was
be
wondering
slow.
if that was me because my internet can be a little bit crappy sometimes. But hey,
I guess
it's
it's
not me this
possible.
time.
Yeah, it's possible my internet's doing weird stuff. It is like snowing / wintry mixing right now, so
Do it.
Anyways,
yeah. Basically, yeah. The point though is that I have learned that in a lot of like, I guess in the food processing industry, they have very thin margins, and they're almost largely supported by government subsidies, anyways. They're almost incapable of being profitable, but because the people got to eat. Yeah, any like excess downtime is basically the Satan incarnate for them. So, any
I mean, if they're basically propped up by the government anyways, why not just fucking nationalize it? I mean, I know the answer, but still, nice thought.
You're right. No, you're right. I mean,
Yeah, no, you're
it's
absolutely right.
socially supported anyways. So,
And in other industries, you have what they call like just-in-time production, where
Yeah.
which is another thing where if you have downtime, then you lose money because you have no essentially buffer.
yeah,
It's
and it
also the
ripples.
reason why COVID was
Yeah,
Yeah, it ripples all the way
unnecessarily.
down the supply chain. Fuck over like
that's why
tons
we
and
had
tons of
toilet
different
paper
firms.
shortages.
Mm.
And why I will probably forever keep like multiple packages of toilet paper in my closet for the rest of my life. I'm gonna be like that, it's like one of those weird depression habits that old people have.
Yeah. Or just buy like really cheap old sheets and just chop them into squares. Emergency supply. It's reusable.
You know, I was hoping you weren't going there with the reusable part.
Well,
Yeah, no,
And
I'm
then he
I'm gonna
went
go
there.
with
that's how
Yeah, I
they
was
used
The
to
gonna
do
say,
it.
no.
reusable toilet paper is kind of repulsive.
I mean, that's how it
Yeah,
used to be done
I
for
feel like
generations
a bidet.
before.
I feel like a
I mean,
bidet is a
fair,
better
but-
solution.
Oh,
I have this
I'm thinking
amazing
of like I'm
sanitary
thinking of a
product called a
very
freaking bidet.
yeah. I was gonna say I'm thinking of an absolutely dire scenario where there's like infrastructure failure. But anyway, yeah.
So, like, maybe 15 years from now.
yeah, maybe I'm just watching too much Last of Us.
Yeah.
It's like re-scratching all of the post-apocalypse itches. Oh man, yeah. What would you do in this situation where you don't have blank, luxury?
Y'all just reminded me of fucking something that I learned about Roman bathhouses recently, where, a bathhouse was like both a bathing area and also a bathroom. And they would have a single sponge on a stick that everyone would share. And no, it did not get regularly cleaned.
Yep,
Mm.
the communal shit sponge.
And with that, Section 5.
Yeah, that doesn't make much sense to me, but sure. I guess the Romans were just on a weird level. Yeah. All right, Section 5, getting more into the struggle for a normal working day. So laws for the compulsory extension. So yeah, this is, this is like some older laws. He's really rewinding the clock here. Where this is like early on in capitalist development, where they needed to basically mandate the working day to be fairly long, in order to make profits. Because early on, if you think about it, the labor of people would have been pretty underdeveloped, meaning there wasn't much education. Like whatever production you would be engaged in would be like, it wasn't as mechanized yet. It wasn't like fully industrialized. So the amount of time you would have had to work in order to pay off the necessary labor time would have been pretty large, right? It could be 6, 8, 10 hours. So the only way to make a profit is to work really, really long hours. And people weren't used to that, especially when you're trying to get like these serfs, peasants, vagabonds, whatever. You're trying to get people off the street to come into the factory. Early on, that was like really unattractive, right? Like nobody wanted to do that. They knew it was shitty. They knew they'd have to work insane hours, and they're like, no, I'd rather just like work a field, during the harvest season and chill out the rest of the year. But that would not allow for capitalist development. So you'd have the state start stepping in and basically making a lot of like anti-vagrant laws, anti-loitering, anti-vagabond. Basically, like it's illegal to be a bum, basically. So they're basically giving people like fewer and fewer opportunities to not be workers, and forcing them into the factories. So that's kind of what he gets into a little bit. But to get into the intro paragraph here, so he says, what is a working day? What is the length of time during which capital may consume the labor power whose daily value it is paid for? How far may the working day be extended beyond the amount of labor time necessary for the reproduction of labor power itself? We've seen that capital's reply to these questions is this. The working day contains the full 24 hours, and with the deduction of the few hours of rest without much labor power, is absolutely incapable of renewing its services. Hence, it is self-evident that the worker is nothing other than labor power for the duration of his whole life, and that therefore all his disposable time is by nature and by right labor time, to be devoted to the self-valorization capital. Time for education, for intellectual development, fulfillment of social functions, social intercourse, and for the free play of the vital forces of his body and mind, even the rest time of Sunday. What foolishness! But in its blind and measureless drive, its insatiable appetite for surplus labor, capital oversteps not only the moral but even the merely physical limits of the working day. It usurps the time for growth, development, and healthy maintenance of the body. It steals the time required for the consumption of fresh air and sunlight. It haggles over meal times, and where possible incorporating them into the production process itself, so that food is added to the worker as a mere means of production, as coal supplied to the boiler, and grease and oil to the machinery. Let's get a little. So, capital asks no questions about the length of the life of the labor power. What interests it is purely and simply the maximum of labor power that it can be set in motion during the working day. It attains this objective by shortening the life of labor power in the same way as a greedy farmer snatches more produce from the soil by robbing it of its fertility. So again, right at the end there, you've got that same parallel as before, analogizing the destruction of the natural environment to the destruction of the workforce by capital. Because ultimately, for Marx, there's really not a big difference between the two. They're kind of just, it's the exact same process. It's just that in one situation, we're looking at labor being one specific instance of the natural environment versus everything else that gets destroyed, all the natural resources and so forth. But yeah, so again, it's just kind of a summary of what we've already talked about. Nothing too new there. So start up here and let's see. So, but the value of labor power includes the value of the commodities necessary for the reproduction of the worker, for continuing the existence of the working class. If then the unnatural extension of the working day, which capital necessarily strives for, its unmeasured drive for self-valorization, shortens the life of the individual worker, and therefore the duration of his labor power, forces used up have to be replaced more rapidly, and it will be more expensive to reproduce labor power, just as in the case of a machine. The part of its value that has to be reproduced daily grows greater the more rapidly the machine is worn out. It would seem, therefore, that the interest of capital itself points in the direction of a normal working day. So this is kind of coming back around to that same point as earlier, that somewhat contradictory to the surface level drives of capital, because that whole intro paragraph was basically saying capital does not want you to have any free time, no lunch, sleep as little as possible, and still be able to function, I guess. And yet, ironically, we know that this will lead to this cycle of self-destruction. So, in fact, limits on the normal working day are actually kind of in capital's favor, again, in the long run. So yeah, that's kind of what he's coming back around to. And he kind of goes through a similar parallel here with the with slavery in America, where I think he's basically saying that if slaves are hard to come by, for whatever reason, then you're not going to work them to death. Give them more lenient hours, I guess, or something like that. Whereas if slaves are very easy to acquire, then you should be ideally you'd be working them to the bone, because you can just get new ones. Ultimately, capital makes the exact same calculation with workers as the slave owners do with slaves. So there's that parallel. Because yeah, shockingly, capitalism and slavery not too much different. They're like cousins, sort of. Let's see. Okay, let's skip a bit more here. Okay. 380. What experience generally shows to the capitalist is a constant excess of population, an excess in relation to capital's need for valorization at a given moment. Although this throng of people is made up of generations of stunted, short-lived, and rapidly replaced humans, plucked, so to speak, before they were ripe. And indeed, experience shows to the intelligent observer how rapidly and firmly capitalist production has seized the vital forces of the people at their very roots, although historically speaking, it hardly dates from yesterday. Experience shows, too, how the degeneration of the industrial population is retarded only by the constant absorption of primitive and natural elements from the countryside, and how even the agricultural laborers, in spite of the fresh air and the principle of natural selection that works so powerfully amongst them, and permits the survival of only the strongest individuals, are already beginning to die off. Capital, which has such good reasons for denying the sufferings of the legions of workers surrounding it, allows its actual development to be determined as much and as little by the sight of the coming degradation and final depopulation of the human race, as by the probable fall of the earth into the sun. In every stock jobbing swindle, everyone knows that sometime or another the crash must come, but everyone hopes that it may fall on the head of his neighbor after he himself has caught the shower of gold and placed it in his secure hands. That translates to something in German. Is the watchword of every capitalist and of every capitalist nation, blah, blah, blah. Capital, therefore, takes no account of the health and the length of the...
I'm pretty sure that's French.
Yeah.
Well, the translation
It's
is
not.
some... He translates it to something in German, which doesn't help me much.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
I
It
think
basically,
it's give me the rain.
after
Translated
me,
literally.
yeah, I was gonna say after me the deluge, or after me the rain.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think, well, it's just another way of saying this part, right? Of like,
Yeah.
I want to see the shower of gold and fuck everyone else over.
Yep, basically
Yeah, that makes sense.
pull the ladder up behind you, kind of.
Yeah. So another way of putting that is this: that capital takes no account of the health and length of the life of the worker unless society forces it to do so. Its answer to the outcry about the physical and mental degradation, the premature death, the torture of overwork is this: should that pain trouble us, since it increases our profit? But look at these things as a whole. It is evident that this does not depend on the will, either good or bad, of the individual capitalist. Under free competition, the immanent laws of capitalist production confront the individual capitalist as a coercive force external to him. So, this passage definitely has some strong, reminiscence to the Capital is a Real God essay, right? This coercive external force that basically is almost puppeteering any individual capitalist. And no matter how many times liberals can be like, oh, but my boss was like kind of nice on occasion, they would take us out to lunch once a month. It's like, okay, that's not what we're concerned about. We're talking about the capitalist class here. Because no matter, even if you have a slightly nicer than average boss, capitalist, whatever, they're still subject to the laws of competition and the external coerciveness of it. Because if they're too nice, they will get bought out or run out of business or whatever, and they will cease to be capitalists for very long. So ultimately, they have very little agency in the whole process. Or in other words, their agency is strongly incentivized towards being as ruthlessly exploitative as possible. That anything that is less than that is essentially punished, or will bring them closer to going out of business. So yeah, and again, it's another case of Marx basically saying, "Listen, it's please stop thinking individually. It's not what we're about." Parts.
Remember, systems have interchangeable parts that must be accounted for, otherwise you don't get the full frickin' picture.
Yeah, that's another way of putting it.
Mm-hmm. Because we get a lot of that in this current era of, but maybe if we had a kinder, more humane version of parasitic disease X, it wouldn't eat us as fast.
Yeah. Or there's also the kind of false distinction between the quote unquote mom and pop capitalists versus the big evil corporations. Like for some reason, it's pretty easy to get almost anybody to identify large corporations like Amazon or whatever that to be really scummy. Like nobody, very very few people actually like large giga corporations, which, I guess it's a step in their direction. But unfortunately, they'll turn around and be like, well, but what about the small businesses, right? They're so much nicer. Kind of almost implying that because they're small is is due to the fact that they are, better people or something like that. I don't know. But it's like trying to explain huge systemic differences, like vast. Trying to say huge orders of magnitude in like wealth distribution, basically, is somehow explainable by what personality traits.
And that has like a huge contradiction and just like massive cognitive dissonance with the whole attitude of wealth being somehow tied up with like virtue. At least in the U.S. and a lot of the I guess what you'd call like the Christian West, where it's kind of seen like if you're wealthy, then obviously you must have done something virtuous to be successful. But then you like with what you were just saying, there's a huge contradiction where okay, yeah, big corporations and too much wealth, okay, that's bad apparently, but the small business, they're the paragon of virtue because moderation, I guess.
Yeah.
Just
They're 90% of the economy, and they don't at all occasionally frequently resort to literally the same horseshit.
yeah,
I thought that statistic is because those gigantic multinational corporations classify themselves as small businesses.
That is correct.
Yeah.
that's also probably true.
Or they can chop themselves up into hundreds of subsidiary companies that are technically
Shell
small.
game.
Yeah, but they all feed into the same, like, absolutely titanic capital that really controls all of them.
And I think the other thing is with the small business, you can be like, you should support the small businesses because you don't local economy and you don't want these people to go out of business because they've worked hard to build this small little thing that they have, and I'm like, okay, sure, but if they go out of business, what happens? They become workers again, right? Like it's not like they're gonna starve like if I get fired from my job.
Yeah, and they have that. I think with a lot of that mindset is implying is what the Marx calls in the manifesto like petty bourgeois socialism. It's like this fantasy of every single person being petty bourgeois, Like everybody owns their own little business, a small business, and it's like, okay, but like who's doing the work? Like that we can't all make money off each other by exploiting everybody like one for one. Like it's just completely possible because, well, first of all,
And
if you have any competition in that system, even if you magically hit a switch and just said, okay, tomorrow we're starting from scratch. Everyone on Earth starts out with $500 of capital, and we're just going to see what happens. Well, guess what? Like, you're going to rapidly find the consolidation of really big capitals very rapidly, because a lot of people
That
are
is
going to.
literally how the game of Monopoly works.
Yeah, and it's like,
Yep.
obviously, I know that's like insanely idealistic. That's the point of pointing out the lunacy of that perspective. But even if you grant them, if you say, yeah, you know what, let's pretend everyone starts on this mythical even playing ground, everyone has the same amount of starting capital, it doesn't matter. You will still end up with monopolies, you will still end up with giant corporations dominating everything while the petty bourgeois just squabble over the crumbs.
Yep. Because
So,
the
yeah.
nature of competition and a capitalist system is always going to trend towards monopoly.
It's basically the same way, whereas when people do the bullshit like, oh, well, like, you know, socialism doesn't even work in theory. It's like, or it works in theory, but not in practice or something. You're like, bitch, capitalism doesn't even work in theory like the way you want.
Doesn't even work in practice.
Or rather, we should say that like all the problems that capitalism has caused is theoretically what should happen. Which means, yeah, like Marx's analysis is pretty damn on point here.
The whole first 3 chapters of Capital is, wow, capitalism sounds good in theory, but it's terrible in practice.
With an addendum of, why do you keep doing this to yourself? Why do you keep doing this to yourself? Why do you keep doing this to yourself?
Well, and that's what's crazy. It's like up until this chapter where he really gives like, he dumps all the empirical evidence out, kind of all at once. Like, even if you just read this book and sort of skip, you only read the chapters that are basically the theoretical construction of capitalism. And this, by the way, Marx's version is very generous. It's a very idealized version of capitalism, and he says as much all the time, right? He's constantly saying that he's making abstractions and simplifications and stuff like that. So even for a very idealized system, he's constantly showing us how it will just inevitably self-destruct and cause either the death of the planet or the death of the working class, or some potentially both. It's pretty, it's like, yeah, that's the point, is that like, listen, you could pretend like you could, if you rewound to like a pre-capitalist society, you gave someone this book and we're like, look at this amazing economic system this guy came up with, people read it and be like, no, we don't want this, this is terrible, why would we ever do this? Yeah, it's the economic system no one would actually consciously choose, because it is kind of the worst possible one. Okay, let's go to section 6. Oops, I skipped it. Okay. Okay, I didn't have too many notes in chapter 6 because it's more history stuff. Kind of the labor laws in England and stuff like that. Well, this time period at least. So starting before Marx was writing and up until roughly when he was writing, so about mid 1860s. So yeah, they're kind of. I guess I'll read the first paragraph just to give that quick intro. All right, so he says after capital had taken centuries to extend the working day to its normal maximum limit, and then beyond this limit to the natural day of 12 hours, there followed with the birth of large scale industry in the last third of the 18th century and an avalanche of violent and unmeasured encroachments. Every boundary set by morality and nature, age and sex, day and night was broken down. Even the ideas of day and night, which in the old statutes were of peasant simplicity, became so confused that an English judge as late as 1860 needed the penetration of an interpreter of Talmud to explain judicially what was day and what was night. Capital was celebrating its origins. So that's definitely some interesting language from Marx, but yeah, basically showing how even up in as early as 1860, although he calls it as late, to us it's a kind of early, but yeah, he's saying as recently as 1860. This is one way to put it. Capital had already kind of hegemonically convinced everyone that like day and night was sort of up for interpretation, which is pretty sadistic. Because again, David Harvey does a pretty good job of explaining this, right? Where I guess Marx uses the idea of peasant simplicity, but like things like a day-night cycle should be pretty damn simple, enough for someone who's very uneducated to understand. Right, sun is up, it's day. Sun is down, it's night. Okay, good to know. But I guess it's kind of getting us to realize like just how influential capitalist hegemony can be when it starts trying to literally redefine what day and night is. Something so simple and so basic to pretty much everybody's life. So yeah, it's pretty insidious stuff. Okay, more fast forwarding through the data here. I think. Yeah, okay. This is what I wanted to read. Okay, yeah, why not? Okay, so he says the preliminary campaign of capital thus came to grief. The 10 Hours Act came into force on the 1st of May, 1948. Meanwhile, however, the fiasco of the Chartist Party, whose leaders had been imprisoned, whose organization dismembered, had shattered the self-confidence of the English working class. Soon after this, the June insurrection in Paris and its bloody suppression united in England as on the continent all fractions of the ruling classes, landowners and capitalists, stock exchange sharks and small-time shopkeepers, protectionists and free traders, government and opposition, priests and freethinkers, young whores and old nuns, under the common slogan of the Salvation: property, religion, family, and society. Everywhere the working class was outlawed, anathemized, and placed under the dissuspects, or however you say that.
Suspect.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one that Harvey pointed out, so I thought we'd reiterate. But yeah, this is Marx basically demonstrating that, as soon as capital feels threatened, especially threatened by labor movements specifically, boy, does the capitalist class show some pretty insane solidarity within itself, right? He's basically telling us that like everybody in the ruling class is on board to team up, work together, to just absolutely crush the working class. And again, another slogan he throws out. Well, he's simplifying it, right? But it's largely remained unchanged from when Marx is writing till today, right? Because what do conservatives or liberals always jump straight for when they feel threatened? Personal, private property, some kind of religious, idealism that they'll cling to. So-called, so-called family values, or just the family as some social construct. And there's also just the idea of society, right?
Live in a society.
We do live in a society. But I think it's even more insidious a lot of times, especially
Oh,
in the more
absolutely. I'm
fast.
sorry, I was joking.
Well, I know. I was just saying, like, it can be more insidious, especially on the fascist side of things, because they will specify. They'll be like, oh, it's not just society. It's like Western society, or some dog whistle like that.
Christian society,
yeah,
civilized society.
You gotta be, exactly. Like, you gotta have property rights. Gotta have, for the most part, Christianity. Although there's also, like, I mean, I don't think there's any. If there are any Indian comrades, maybe speak up. But I think also, I know in India they have some pretty hardline, like, Hindu nationalists and stuff. So it's not just Christianity.
Oh yeah, Modi's entire party, Doodle, has gone on some very long tangents regarding the oh god,
It's
that
terrifying.
entire thing.
Yeah.
I will not go on a huge tangent because I'm not as informed as she is, but yeah, I know it's still a problem, at least. So, and then of course there's always, like, the mythologized nuclear family, and I'm sure, and things like, the most recent iteration of, like, trans panic is they always classify it as, like, they're gonna ruin our families and our children and blah 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 blah. It's like just the same old appeals.
I was gonna say, for every economic crisis, for every working class uprising, or every instance of the working class starting to gain an upper hand, you can find a concurrent moral panic within history. Sometimes you have to look, because the further back you go, documentation becomes scarce and sparse. But so, like, in the late 70s and the early, you had the satanic panic. In the 90s, you had violent video games and rap music. There's every generation, every decade has its moral panics that are literally intended to both distract from real problems as well as reinforce that sort of property, religion, family, and society slogan in some form or fashion.
Yeah, and it's exactly. It's like, if you need evidence that those arguments are totally fabricated, well, they haven't changed for approximately 150 years, or probably longer than that, really. But at least since Marx wrote Capital in 1860 something, it's exactly the same arguments. Yeah, it literally has not changed.
It's cyclical, and you see the same things over and over, blaming, whatever the popular culture is at the time.
Right. It's like the specific thing they're targeting might change, but the overall
paperback books. Like the popular novel was a big thing, I think, in the early 20th century, or rock music in the mid 20th century. It's whatever the kids are doing generally is the heart of each decade's moral panic.
Yeah, we gotta be diligent, though, especially when it comes to our trans comrades. They are
absolutely
aggressively scapegoated and it is
Yeah, I don't
pretty
mean
scary.
to minimize it.
No, but
I don't mean to minimize it at all, just
I
because
know
in the
it.
past
Part of me wishes they
they've
would
been
demonize.
ridiculous.
As like part of me
Yeah.
wishes they would demonize just rock music, but Lord knows they can't help themselves. And
Right,
target
right. I mean, this is the first
innocence.
time in quite a long time that the moral panic has actually surrounded itself around, I'm going to say, an actual class of people, an actual minority of people, and it's just literally because
I mean,
we've got
there's other. I think there's other recent
Wasn't there a
ones,
whole
like-
panic
I'm saying
about
it's the
gay
old-
people? Like,
yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
that was like the
in the 80s and the
90s.
90s.
There's
and the
always
AIDS,
one,
AIDS-
frankly.
Yeah, 80s and 90s was like a lot of
But the point-
LGBTQ
yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
And then, but even more recently, I was actually thinking another one I can think of is just immigrants
Oh
as like
yeah,
a
that's
very
also
vague
that's a
category
common
of
one.
people. But
Yeah, and
that's why it
anytime
works so
you
well.
are-
Is it's super vague.
They took
It's
our
hard to
jobs.
point like to a instance of them. It's just like, yeah, it's a hard to pin down category, and they're just making up all this bullshit about it.
But like I feel like at this point this is kind of where you have the, I'm gonna say, the meeting of both a panic over a cultural zeitgeist along with the fascistic othering of a minority group.
Correct.
And it's
yeah,
it's
it's
very scary. Because
but
because
that's
this has
fortunately
the-
we know
this
that
has
it's
sort
not
of like,
it's
yeah.
not new. That's why
Yeah, no, absolutely not. But I mean, it's like this definitely has that, oh my gosh, all of the kids are gay, which, I mean, statistically, a lot more of Gen Z identifies as queer openly than any previous generation. And that's largely a function of the fact that decades of activism has made them feel safer to do so. It's not that suddenly, the gay agenda has suddenly reached their recruitment goals.
right.
But
Yeah, I know we're
your
also
yeah.
we're preaching
Yeah.
to the choir here, but
Yeah, no, absolutely.
We're-
But
exactly. But like
but it also doesn't
when
hurt
you-
to work through it on occasion.
exactly, I think it is important for everyone to be conscious of that type of dog whistle type rhetoric. It's like, listen, they're pretty much just defending their class interests at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
even if they're not defending their own class interests, they're defending the ruling class interests, which hopefully, if you can shed some light on that, you maybe can get through to some people who otherwise have very reactionary takes on things. So, yeah.
Another version of get the working class to fight themselves.
Ye olde divide and conquer as it has always been.
Yep.
Well, not always, but frequently enough to be super irritating.
Okay. Let's see. We're scrolling. By the way, I think we're doing a pretty okay on time right now, but I think probably save chapter 11 for next time.
Yeah, that's fine.
Not only because it is important and we probably should, it's pretty short, but what's in there is actually pretty darn important. But it also leads into the next couple of chapters like really nicely. So I think there's a couple of reasons to do that, but yeah, we'll just say
Well, and
for
also
now.
because we're doing kind of an alternate reading next week that's pretty short.
Oh, I guess when
that-
I said next time, I guess I'm not. Yeah, you're right. We're taking a break next week from Capital, but next time we come back to Capital, we'll recover chapter 11 before 12 and 13.
Although Harvey does kind of gloss over it to a degree as a transitionary chapter. But
He
there
does
are
go
some,
over it in 10 minutes, but at least my reading of it, I'm like, there's a lot going on here that he does glaze over. Like the whole difference between like he basically lays out like kind of the definition of petty bourgeois, which I know I mean, every couple days it seems like in one of the other, like in the Theory channel, for example, you'll have somebody asking like, "Is this profession petty bourgeois?" It's like this is. I mean, if you guys,
Yeah.
it's like if you just understood
If
some
you have to
theory, you could
ask.
answer your own questions.
I mean, I think perhaps part of the reason why he glossed over it is because it essentially outlines stuff that he goes into more depth in the next section. But
Yeah, that's fair. But
You
that's also
also
why
get
it's a good
lot
primer
of
for the next section too.
yeah. You also do get a lot of reframing of what old words meant in their context to things that they were never supposed to mean, which is a really old game played by basically every reactionary group ever. Hey, this word here means anything I don't like. Ooh.
Yeah, and I guess you're right. I guess if we would want to cover it now and then have a basically 2 week break and try to actually remember what the hell we were talking about. At least chapter 10 is really self-contained, so
yeah,
it
no,
works
like
out that
I
way.
feel like chapter 10 is probably like the origin of, and and the future, the previous origin of many economic theses.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be surprised if this is the most commonly cited or quoted chapter in all of Capital.
Complete with vampires, just to make sure Nikolai gets his vampires in.
That's right. They're important.
Like
There's like
if
four different vampire references or something.
if I were allowed to be like the based economics teacher ever, I would assign chapter 10 of Capital and then basically say rewrite one of his instances with a modern example.
Or replace vampire with chupacabra.
I thought they were quotes.
Because visualizing capitalists as shriveled up goat dogs.
With severe mange and a bloodthirst.
Yeah. Okay, let's. All right, let's go to section 7. All right, last one. Last section of chapter 10. All right, so let's see. Again, we're doing a little review here. So Marx is gonna take a look at how the English factory legislation that he kind of just went over kind of had these ripple effects in other parts of the world, and it's pretty interesting to take a look at here. So he says, without anticipating subsequent developments, the following points can be derived merely by connecting together the historical facts. First, capital's drive towards a boundless and ruthless extension of the working day is satisfied first in those industries which were first to be revolutionized by water power, steam, and machinery. In those earliest creations of the modern mode of production, the spinning of cotton, wool, flax, and silk. The changed material mode of production, and the correspondingly changed social relations of the producers first gave rise to outrages without measure, and then called forth opposition to this social control, which legally limits, regulates, and makes uniform the working day and its pauses. During the first half of the 19th century, this control therefore appears simply as legislation for exceptions. As soon as the Factory Acts had conquered the original domain of the new production, it was found that in the meantime many other branches of production had made their entry into the factory system properly so called, manufacturers with more or less obsolete methods like pottery, glassmaking, blah blah blah, and finally that even sadder so-called domestic industry such as nail making had long since fallen under capitalist exploitation as the factories themselves. Factory legislation was therefore compelled gradually to strip itself of its exceptional character, or to declare that any house in which work was done was a factory. In England, the law proceeds in the manner of the Roman Socialists. So I think this is kind of just walking through how, yeah, these laws may have first applied to the large factories and heavily industrialized industries. They eventually just kind of spread to everything, and indeed they included any house where you did work, if it was the one you lived in. And then he says, second, the history of the regulation of the working day in certain branches of production and the struggle still going on in others over this regulation prove conclusively that the isolated worker, the worker is a quote-unquote free seller of his labor power, succumbs without any resistance once capitalist production has reached a certain stage of maturity. The establishment of a normal working day is therefore the product of a protracted and more or less concealed civil war between the capitalist class and the working class. Since the contest takes place in the arena of modern industry, it is fought out first of all in the homeland of that industry, which in this case is England. The English factory workers were the champions not only of the English working class, but of the modern working class in general, just as their theorists were the first to throw down the gauntlet to the theory of the capitalists. Hence, the philosopher of the factory, Ure, considers it a mark of inextinguishable disgrace on the part of the English working class that they wrote the slavery of the factory acts on their banners, as opposed to capital, which was striving manfully for the perfect freedom of labor. He says, France limps behind England, basically saying, they had a very similar course, but just a little behind the curve. Although he does say, French law proclaims as a principle what in England was only one in the name of children, women, and minors. So in other words, those working laws applied to basically working men as well. Then he gets into the American section is actually pretty interesting too. I'll go over that. Well, so he says, in the U.S., every independent workers' movement was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor in a white skin cannot emancipate itself where it is branded in a black skin. However, a new life immediately arose from the death of slavery. The first fruit of the American Civil War was the 8 Hours agitation, which ran from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The General Congress of Labor in Baltimore declared the first and great necessity of the present is to free labor from this country from capitalistic slavery, is the passing of a law by which 8 hours shall be the normal working day in all the Union. And at the same time, the Congress of the the International Working Men's Association in Geneva also declared they want 8 hours. Good job. Good job on that, guy.
We haven't improved since 1866.
That's right.
Oh, with intermittent bouts of extreme regression. Yay.
Yep. And then right at the end here, get to our last vampire reference. So he says, but when the transaction was concluded, it was discovered that he was no free agent, that the period of time for which he is free to sell his labor power is the period of time for which he is forced to sell it. And in fact, the vampire will not let go, while there remains a single muscle, sinew, or drop of blood to be exploited. For protection against the serpent of their agonies, the workers have to put their heads together, and as a class compel the passing of a law, all-powerful social barrier by which they can be prevented from selling themselves and their families into slavery and death by voluntary contract with capital. And in the place of the pompous catalogue of the inalienable rights of man, there steps the modest Magna Carta of the legally limiting working day, which at last makes clear when the time which the worker sells is ended and when his own begins. So yeah, it's pretty cool, kind of tracking the history of some of the earliest class struggle in capitalist development led to the establishment of the normal working day. We're all familiar with, but it's another good example of Marx breaking down a social construct, right? Because that's what the working day is. It's just a social construct, but it's a construct that is developed through class struggle. And in this case, it's pretty specific to capitalist class struggle specifically. So yeah, it's a pretty good chapter. If you obviously if you didn't get a chance to read it yet, like we were saying, definitely check out the audiobook version. Just pop it on, like a 2-hour podcast pretty much. It's pretty awesome.
And honestly, if anybody feels so inclined, just like rewrite chapter 10 with 20 and 21st century examples, publish it as a pamphlet, and do some praxis.
Yeah, that would work. I was gonna say I'd be surprised if someone hasn't already done that.
I mean, probably. If anybody knows where it is, though,
I've
that'd be
not seen anything, but updating it to modern lingua franca would definitely help.
like, I feel like if you could like take this and leave in probably some of like the historical child labor examples, because apparently we're trying to bring that back. But to either augment with or occasionally swap out for modern examples. And yeah, just kind of update this. Like, I feel like you could almost just take chapter 10 as its own and just start distributing it. But more modernizing, you could probably radicalize a lot of people that way. It's kind of a thought I was having, like,
Yeah, no,
the entire
it
time
is
I was reading
interesting
this.
because it is interesting because like just like how every time we have these discussions, we're constantly being like, oh well, this is some random example, and the wage theft data is interesting, and then we got like obviously all the anecdotal evidence, but there's also just a shit ton of statistics. But yeah, you're right. It's like a lot of that has not been synthesized, like all compiled into a cohesive work, unless it has, and I just don't know about it. Maybe something on Jay's store.
Yeah, like I said, I'm pretty sure this has been the origin of many of an academic paper where somebody tugs at a thread and follows it, the next 100 years into the future.
Yeah.
But it freaking blows my mind that like this was again written 1860 something.
Yeah, I'm sure you've spent a lot of years writing it, so somewhere in the 60s.
Yeah, but published 1860 something, so making this 160 some odd years old, and we're dealing with the same damn shit. Like, we have improved by just the tiniest amounts, in the sense that we at some point decided that maybe we shouldn't have like kids working in factories anymore, but even at this point it seems like we're not entirely agreed on that fact anymore.
Yeah.
And
I just thought of an idea for a meme where it's the Scooby-Doo meme of pulling the mask off the bad guy, and it's just class struggle.
Yeah, there are a lot of I'm gonna say anti-capitalist Scooby-Doo memes, and they're delightful.
I think Scooby-Doo as a show is pretty anti-capitalist for the most part.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying, like, I mean, and just speaking of putting on like your commie goggles, how much, I mean, despite how much of like our childhood media was just straight up propaganda, some of it was, in retrospect, like, you understand why he might have turned into a socialist.
Makes you think.